everyone. This is the second part of the lesson on absolute value equations, and we're going to talk about graphing, what the graph looks like for absolute value. And really for these problems, the most important thing is just that you kind of recognize the shape of the graph right now, and we're going to use our calculator to do some of the heavy lifting. So let's get started. So this first one we're going to graph by hand, and then like I said, I'm going to talk to you about how to use the calculator. We're going to have to create a table here to be able to graph this thing. So I sort of set up an XYT chart, okay? And I'm just going to throw in a few values of X here. So 0, 1, 2, maybe even 3, let's say. And then remember, Y is the absolute value of X. So it's how far away is this number from 0. So 0 is 0 spaces away from 0. 1 is 1 space away. 2 is 2. 3 is 3. That's pretty boring. Okay, if we go ahead and graph those, it's going to look like this. 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. We could go all the way up to like 10, 10. Okay, that's what this side's going to look like. So what's really interesting about this graph, though, isn't shown so far in our table. It's what happens when the numbers turn negative. So if I put in a -1 or a -4 or a -6, okay, -1 is 1 space away from 0. -4 is 4, and -6 is 6 spaces from 0. Okay, so really what I'm doing is knocking the negatives off there. That's what absolute value is good for. Absolute value gets rid of the negatives when you don't care about whether it's negative or positive. So then I have to include the point -1, +1, -4, +4, and -7, +7. Okay? So you can see that what on the other side looked like a nice straight diagonal line actually becomes a V shape. Okay? And that's what absolute value is always going to look like. The graph of absolute value is always going to have this V shape to it. And the reason for that is absolute value converts all negatives to positives. So when your X values are positive, your Y's are just positive, right? This really corresponds to the graph of Y equals X, just the regular Y equals X. But when your X's turn negative, it's like your line is coming along this way, and then it drops into negative territory, and it goes, and it turns around, and it runs the other way, okay, because it wants to go back into positive territory. So it's really a linear function that's kind of been bent in half to get rid of the negatives, okay? So we could go on making tables of values for these all the time, but your calculator will graph them for you. Now this one should be easy to graph. This is what's called the parent function with no other numbers in there. This is a really easy one to sketch. But we're going to use our graphing calculator to do the other examples here, just because there are some other numbers that are going to do some things to our graph. And we'll talk about those later too. One thing I wanted to mention back here is you have to be careful when you're looking at tables of values here, because notice that if I had not put negative numbers in there, I was picking whatever X values I wanted, but if I had not put negatives in there, I would have come out with a graph that maybe just came out looking like a straight line. You have to be smart enough to know that if you're looking at absolute value, there has to be a bend in the line somewhere. There has to be a place where the line cuts in half, okay? And so you have to make sure that your table covers both sides of the V, okay? And you'll see what I mean when we do this next one. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to graph these in your calculator, and then we're going to just use the table function in our calculator to put the points on my paper here. Okay, and I'm just trying to think of a good way to space this out. I think this should work. Okay, so we're going to go to Y equals. You're going to clear out anything that's there, and you're going to turn off your plot. Okay, so I put my cursor up there. I turned off plot 1. This is what it should look like. Okay, you only have your plot turned on if you're working with data, like we did when we did linear regression. Okay. And then to get those absolute value brackets in there, you're going to go to the Math menu, go over to Number, NUM, and that very first thing, ABS, that's absolute value. So I'm going to hit Enter. Now on mine, it just came up as ABS, and then I can type in whatever I want. On yours, it may come up as actual like brackets, okay? So we're going to type in 1/2, so 1 divided by 2, x minus 3. And then I'm going to graph. Oh, you know what? I forgot something here. What I forgot is I want to go back to looking like this. I want to go back to a nice standard window. So I'm going to hit zoom and number 6. Our graph is all funky because of when we did linear regression. Okay, so that's what our graph looks like. And we knew that these numbers were going to have some effect on the graph. It looks like they've made it a little bit wider. It looks like they've moved where that vertex point is. Oh, you can't see what I'm pointing at, but they moved this from the origin. All of that's fine. All of that's what's going to happen when you put other numbers in here. We just need to figure out a way to transfer this to our paper. So I'm going to look at my table here. Okay. And your table might look different than mine right now. Remember, you can scroll up and down here. So here's me resetting at 0. And so I'm just going to start grabbing some points that I feel like graphing. And I don't feel like graphing 0.5s because then I have to estimate. So like I'm going to graph 0, 3, for example. I'm going to graph -2, 4. Okay. I'm going to graph 2, 2. 4, 1, I see. Here. And I mean, I have 4 dots on my graph, but what I have written here is not really enough to see that bend, right? So I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to keep trying to grab points until I can see where it's supposed to curve. And from looking at my graph a second ago, I know that's going to happen somewhere over here. I may even be able to count it off of here. But so I'm just going to keep going. I see at 6, I'm right at 0. That seems like an important point to put down for me. So 6, 0. And then when I drop down to 8, I'm back up at +1. So right there, now I can start to see the bend in the graph. I might throw one more point on there just for good measure. 10, 2 would be here. And that should be enough to get a nice absolute value graph drawn. Now, do I need to draw that many points every single time? No, definitely not, okay? But you have to draw enough to where you can see the V, where you can see both sides of the V. And I could have skipped around and maybe not graphed every single one of these. That would have been fine as well. But that's how you get the points off your calculator and onto your paper. Okay, so when I do this next one, y equals, I'm going to clear what's there, and I'm going to start again with absolute value. So that's math over to number, and that very first option is ABS. And I'm just putting a 3x in there. So I'm going to go ahead and close my parentheses because that shows that that's what's in there. And then on the end of that, I'm going to tack on a -5. Okay? I'm going to hit graph just so I get a good visual. Okay, I can see the V, I can see both sides of it. And then I'm going to go to my table and just start graphing points that I like. So 4, 7, I mean, I could graph that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, but these numbers down here seem a little bit large. So I'm going to scroll up and get some smaller ones. So I see 2, 1. Okay, I can handle that one. I see 1, -2, which is here. 0, -5. 3, 4, 5. Okay. And then you'll start to see how the numbers are repeating, going backwards? That's where that symmetry comes in. So I know I have -1, -2. I have -2, +1. And I have -3, +4. Okay. And looking at my graph, that's enough for me to see the V. So I'm going to go ahead and draw in these lines. Okay. So again, there's no hard and fast rule about how many points you have to draw, just enough to make sure that your V is located in the correct spot. And I would try to make sure that you locate that vertex because that's a good point for you to be able to see. Okay, that's really about it for this part of the lesson. And on the graphing, you have a couple of these to do on your homework for tonight. Oh, excuse me. yeah, we'll go over these in class tomorrow if you have any questions. All right, have a great day.